Welcome, dreamers. Tonight on Boring Dreamy Historian, we're drifting into the slow, dusty corners of the past. Back when a good bath was once a year entertainment, dinner might involve more turnips than taste, and travel meant sore feet rather than cheap flights. These were times when people survived on patience, superstition, and the occasional miracle of clean drinking water. So before you settle in, take a moment to gently tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy these meandering journeys through history. And let me know down in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I always find it strangely comforting to know this sleepy little community is scattered across the world, nodding off together. Now lower the lights, get comfortable, and let the past do the rest. The banquet hall is warm, the torches flickering against painted columns, the air thick with food and laughter. You sit among the guests, adjusting the folds of linen at your shoulder, and notice something unusual. Every person around you is wearing a cone, not a crown, not a jewel, but a small mound of perfumed fat, balanced neatly on the head. At first it looks comic, almost absurd, but then the heat of the room begins to soften it. Slowly it melts, releasing a fragrance of myrrh and cinnamon, dripping gently into wigs and hair. The air grows heavier, sweeter, and in that moment, the banquet feels less like a dinner, and more like a dream. Perfume cones were one of the quieter luxuries of ancient Egypt, and their presence in paintings puzzled scholars for generations. Were they real? Were they symbolic? For centuries historians debated, but residue analysis of archaeological finds has shown that these cones existed, made of fat or wax blended with oils and resins imported from distant lands. To wear one was to carry the wealth of the world on your head. Myrrh from Punt, frankincense from Arabia, cinnamon from Asia, all melted together into an invisible cloud of fragrance that marked the evening as something special. To the Egyptians, perfume was more than comfort. It was health, morality, even piety. They believed that to smell pleasant was to be close to the gods, while foul odors marked decay, disorder, and shame. In this way, the cone was not merely an ornament, but a declaration of refinement. It announced that the guest beneath it lived in harmony with both people and divinity. The banquet itself was a spectacle of detail. Low tables held bowls of dates, platters of roasted goose, and pitchers of barley beer. Musicians strummed harps, their strings plucked in rhythm with dancers whose movements flickered in the firelight. Servants passed steadily between the guests, balancing trays of lentil stew and cucumbers, their sandals slapping softly against the floor. And over it all, the scent of the cones spread like a curtain, sweetening the mingled smells of food, sweat, and smoke. As you sit among them, you notice the oil trickling down into the wig you wear, smoothing the strands, making them gleam. Egyptian wigs were important symbols themselves, crafted from human hair or plant fibers, styled carefully, and often scented already. The melting cone worked like a conditioner, softening and perfuming at once. By the end of the evening, you would leave with shining hair and a fragrance that clung long after the lamps had gone out. But cones were not for everyone. They were costly, reserved for the wealthy, the noble, and the fortunate. The resins came from faraway coasts, carried by caravans across deserts, or loaded onto ships bound for the Nile. A cone was, in a sense, a map of empire. To wear one was to show not only personal refinement, but also the reach of Egypt's trade, its connections to lands beyond the horizon. Common laborers, who ate onions and bread and drank beer in small mud brick homes, could only imagine such luxury. For them, the banquet with its perfumes was an image painted on tomb walls, a vision of an afterlife where even the poorest might one day smell sweet. There was also something sacred about the cones. Perfume was thought to please the gods, to nourish them in a way food nourished mortals. Temples burned incense endlessly. Statues of gods were anointed with oils. To sit in a banquet hall wearing a cone was in a small way to participate in that sacred rhythm. The fragrance rising into the air was not only for you or your neighbors, it was for the divine, a subtle offering hidden in the midst of merriment. And yet the practicality nags at you. Did the cones drip unpleasantly, staining fine linen robe? Did the oil run into eyes or cause wigs to slide out of place? Some historians argue that they melted slowly, their fat dense enough to release fragrance without melt. Others believe they were painted as symbols more often than actually worn, an ideal representation of sweetness rather than a literal accessory. The truth, as always, may lie somewhere in between. Cones used in certain feasts, painted in art to suggest a perfection that real life could not always match. Still, there is something almost hypnotic about them. The slow melting, the way fragrance builds layer by layer, the silent ritual of becoming perfumed over the course of an evening. It reminds you that luxury is often less about spectacle than about patience. The cone did not dazzle like gold. It waited, it dripped, it turned time itself into perfume. When the lamps are finally extinguished and the guests rise to leave, the hall remains scented, thick with the memory of the night. Outside, the desert air is cooler, the stars sharp above the night. You step into the darkness still carrying the fragrance on your skin, a reminder of the strange, sweet invention that turned a simple banquet into something closer to the divine. But the banquet is only one chapter of the cone's story. If they melted on the heads of nobles in great feasts, how else were they used? Did priests wear them in temples as offerings to the gods? Were they placed in tombs to perfume the dead for eternity? Were they ever used in private homes, far from painted halls and formal ceremonies? The answers lie waiting in the fragments left behind. The image of nobles at a banquet, their heads crowned with melting cones, is charming, but it raises a deeper question. Why did ancient Egyptians care so profoundly about smell? To understand the cones, you must step back from the laughter of the banquet hall and into the rhythms of daily Egyptian life, where fragrance was not simply an indulgence, but a quiet thread binding health, status, and the sacred. In the bustling streets of Thebes or Memphis, the air was not always sweet. The Nile, lifeblood of Egypt, carried not only fertile silt, but also the less romantic odors of fish, mud, and humanity. Markets overflowed with onions, garlic, dried fish, and beer, essential, nourishing foods, but pungent enough to cling to clothing and skin. Life was lived closely, with families packed into small houses of mud brick, animals nearby, and waste often disposed of in ways that modern noses would find unbearable. In such a world, perfume was not frivolous. It was armor, protection against the sharp edges of odor that accompanied daily survival. The Egyptians believed that fragrance could repel illness. They had no microscopes, no understanding of bacteria, but they observed that sweet-smelling resins burned in temples seemed to purify the air, calming both body and spirit. Oils of myrrh and frankincense were rubbed into the skin as medicine for aches, cuts, or fever. The very act of anointing, a daily ritual for the wealthy, was as much about health as beauty. To smell pleasant was to live well, to be balanced, to be closer to the god. This cultural emphasis explains why perfume cones appear not only in scenes of banquets, but also in depictions of religious ceremony. Priests serving in temples shaved their entire bodies to maintain ritual purity, then covered themselves with oils and resins before stepping into sacred spaces. Some scholars suggest that cones may have been worn in such contexts, slowly releasing their fragrance while rituals unfold. Imagine a priest bowing before a statue of Amun, his head crowned with a cone that softens in the torchlight, its aroma drifting upward like an invisible offering. In that sense, cones were not merely luxury, they were bridges between the human and the divine. Trade supported this world of fragrance. Egypt itself did not produce frankincense or myrrh. These came from the mysterious land of Punt, a region south of Egypt, possibly in modern Eritrea or Somalia. Egyptian ships set sail down the Red Sea to collect these precious resins, bringing them back as part of royal expeditions. Scenes carved into temple walls show long lines of exotic goods: giraffes, incense trees, leopard skins, all symbols of distance, rarity, and power. Every cone of perfume, then, carried with it the echo of these voyages. To wear one was not just to smell sweet, but to participate in a network that stretched across seas and deserts. Perfume also marked social distinction. Archaeologists have uncovered small alabaster jars used to store oils, their smooth surfaces carved delicately, their contents once as valuable as jewels. To own such jars was a privilege. To wear cones at dinner was a public declaration of wealth. In contrast, poorer Egyptians relied on simpler scents, perhaps rubbing themselves with castor oil or burning scraps of resin when they could. The divide between rich and poor could be smelled as clearly as it could be seen. There is also the matter of wig. In Egyptian society, wigs were practical and symbolic. They offered protection from the sun, allowed endless variation of style, and served as markers of status. The cones melted directly into these wigs, not only perfuming them but also keeping them supple and glossy. Scholars studying wigs from tombs have found residues of oils, suggesting that fragrance was a built-in part of hair care. Thus, the cone was more than a decorative accessory. It was a functional cosmetic tool. Night after night, banquet after banquet, cones helped maintain the very wigs that completed an Egyptian's appearance. And yet, the mystery lingers. If cones were so practical and so symbolic, Why do they appear almost exclusively in artistic depictions of feasts and ceremony? For centuries, historians argued that cones were never real, that they were artistic shorthand for fragrance, a way for painters to signal this scene smells sweet, without actually describing the detail. Tomb art, after all, was symbolic more than literal, a guide to the afterlife rather than a snapshot of reality. But then, discoveries shifted the debate. In 2019, archaeologists working at Amana uncovered two rare objects, shaped like cones, made of a waxy substance. Chemical analysis revealed traces of animal fat and aromatic substances. Though degraded by centuries, they confirmed what many had suspected. Perfume cones were not mere imagination. They were tangible, crafted, and worn. The paintings were not exaggerations, but records of a practice that had quietly slipped out of memory. Still, questions remain. Were cones worn often, or reserved only for elite occasions? Did every noble guest receive one at banquets, or only the most honored? Were they perfumed differently, for men and women, or adjusted according to the season? The evidence is thin, the answers elusive. History has given us fragments, but the full texture of the practice lies just beyond our reach. And so, when you imagine yourself seated in the banquet hall, a cone balanced delicately on your head, you are also part of that mystery. The fragrance dripping into your wig links you to kings and priests, to trade routes and temples, to myths of gods who delighted in sweetness. But you are also linked to the unknown, the unanswered, the forgotten. The cone is both present and absent, both fact and symbol, both object and idea, which leads to a final question. If cones were part of earthly banquets, and perhaps sacred rituals, what role did they play in death? Were the dead sent into eternity with perfume cones melting on their brows, carrying fragrance into the afterlife? Or did cones belong only to the living, melting away in the fleeting warmth of feasts and ceremonies, vanishing with the night? The tombs may yet have an answer, waiting in the silence beneath the sand. The tomb is cool, silent and heavy with the scent of centuries-old dust. Torches flicker as archaeologists brush away grains of sand, revealing walls painted in rich colors that have somehow resisted time. The banquet scenes are familiar now. Rows of guests in elegant linen, musicians plucking harps, dancers frozen in mid-step, and always, the cones, those strange white shapes, perched neatly atop wigs, melting silently as if time itself could drip like wax. What role, then, did these cones play in the world beyond the banquet hall? In Egyptian belief, death was not an ending, but a continuation, a passage into a perfected version of life. Tomb paintings were not decorative, they were functional. They provided the soul with images to guide it into eternity, assurances that the comforts of life would continue in the afterworld. If perfume cones appear so often in these tombs, it suggests they were more than temporary fashion. They were promises that the deceased would always be sweet-smelling, always adorned, always seated in banquets that never ended. Perfume in death mirrored perfume in life. Priests embalming bodies used oils of cedar and juniper, resin from pine, and myrrh to preserve the flesh. These scents filled the chambers where mummification took place, creating a pungent sweetness that was both antiseptic and symbolic. To mask decay was to cheat it, to transform corruption into preservation. A perfume cone placed in the afterlife may have been an extension of this belief. The body could pass into eternity, not with the foulness of death, but with the fragrance of divinity. It is easy to overlook how central the sense of smell was to ancient life. Today, we tend to prioritize sight and sound. We record our world in pictures and voices, but the Egyptians lived in an environment where scent was deeply tied to health, wealth, and holiness. A cone melting in a banquet hall was as significant as a crown, as intimate as a kiss, as potent as a prayer. When you imagine an Egyptian noble at dinner, you must not only see their garments and hear their laughter, you must smell the sweet cloud rising slowly around them, binding guests together in invisible harmony. There is also something profoundly human about the cone. Beneath their symbolism, they reveal a truth that transcends time. People have always sought small comforts in the face of difficulty. The Egyptians faced floods and droughts, disease and toil, the endless labor of building and sustaining a civilization along the Nile. Yet in the midst of it all, they invented ways to make life more bearable, even beautiful. A melting cone of perfume is not so different from a candle we light today, or the cologne sprayed before a gathering. The details change, but the impulse remains the same: to sweeten the air, to soften the edges of existence, to create a moment of calm amid the noise. And then there is the mystery. Despite the archaeological discoveries, we will never know exactly how it felt to wear one, how heavy it was on the head, how quickly it melted in the Egyptian heat. We can only reconstruct, infer, imagine. That gap between evidence and experience is part of the strange charm of history. It leaves us with a picture painted in fragments, forcing us to supply the missing sense and sensations in our own minds. So what lingers from the story of perfume cones? Not only their material, fat, resin, wax, but their meaning. They remind us that history is not always built on wars or kings, but on small, quiet inventions that shape daily life. They show us that even in the ancient world, people cared about presence, about impression, about leaving behind not just wealth or monuments but fragrance itself. The banquet fades, the lamps gutter, the tombs close, yet the cones remain, hovering in our imagination, halfway between luxury and ritual, between fact and symbol. They melt slowly still, dripping into wigs and walls, perfuming both life and afterlife with the faint sweetness of forgotten time. And so the question lingers. When you think of the great civilization of Egypt, do you picture its pyramids, its temples, its golden pharaohs, or will you also remember the soft invisible cloud of fragrance rising from cones, a gentler monument that has somehow survived in silence? The monastery bells ring in the darkness, pulling you from uneasy dreams. It is the middle of the night, the hour when most of the world still sleeps. But here in the cloisters the rhythm of life is ruled, not by the sun or by the body's needs, but by the strict order of prayer. You rise from your straw mattress, stiff with the chill of stone walls, and shuffle toward the chapel, joining a procession of drowsy figures wrapped in woolen habits. Sleep for medieval monks was never a single unbroken stretch. It was fragmented, divided, carefully structured to leave room for the endless cycle of worship that marked their days. To live as a monk was to surrender the natural pull of the body and replace it with the measured ticking of sacred hours. While ordinary villagers might collapse into bed after a long day of work and wake with the dawn, the monk's sleep was an experiment in interruption. In most monasteries, the pattern was known as the two-sleep system. After the evening prayers, compline, the monks would go to their beds for a few hours. The night was cold and heavy with silence, broken only by the snores of exhausted brethren. But just as the body began to sink into deeper rest, the bell would toll again. It was time for matins, the midnight prayer. The monks would rise, bleary-eyed, and file into the church, chanting psalms in the darkness, their voices echoing off stone arches. Only after this service was complete could they return to bed, finding another short stretch of rest before Lord's at dawn. Imagine it, your body tugged towards sleep, then pulled back into wakefulness, then pushed again into rest, then woken once more. The rhythm was unnatural, and yet it shaped the lives of generations of monks. Some historians suggest that this broken pattern mirrored natural human tendencies before artificial lighting, that left to their own devices, people often slept in two shifts, with a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. Others argue that monks imposed this rhythm deliberately, disciplining their bodies to serve devotion, showing that prayer mattered more than comfort. The conditions hardly made sleep easier. Monastic cells were plain and small, with no luxury beyond a straw pallet, perhaps a thin blanket, and a wooden pillow or none at all. Drafts crept through cracks in the stone. The woolen habit, coarse against the skin, doubled as both daytime garment and night covering. The silence of the cloister was absolute, but it was not the silence of comfort. It was the silence of discipline. Every aspect of the monk's sleep was meant to remind him that rest was temporary, the real focus eternal. Even the act of waking was ritualized. When the bell rang for matins, monks were expected to rise immediately, without hesitation. To linger in bed was considered sloth, a deadly sin. Records from certain monasteries describe punishments for those who failed to rise promptly, from extra fasting to public penance. In some stricter orders, senior monks patrolled the dormitory, checking that no one remained under the covers while others gathered to chant. The message was clear: sleep was a necessity, but never a pleasure. And yet, within this rigid system, there were small human details. Chroniclers sometimes note that older monks or those in poor health were allowed to sleep through the night, excused from the midnight vigil. Some abbots even recognized that too little sleep made for poor chanting and irritable tempers, and quietly adjusted the rules to keep their communities functional. The balance between devotion and exhaustion was delicate. and monasteries walked it differently depending on their order and their abbot's temperament. The monks also saw sleep as a spiritual battleground. Dreams were not simply random images of the mind, they were considered potential messages, or temptations, or even visions of demons. A monk who dreamt of feasts, women, or worldly pleasures was thought to be under attack from evil force. Manuals of spiritual guidance advised careful reflection upon waking, to interpret whether dreams revealed sins to confess or inspirations to cherish. Even in bed, the monk was never entirely free of the watchful eye of his faith. When dawn finally came, sleep was brief and unsatisfying. The bell would summon the brothers again, this time for lauds, the prayer greeting the morning sun. The monks rose from their pattets, rubbing their eyes, their bodies stiff but their minds trained to obedience. In theory, the weariness was a kind of offering, fatigue accepted as proof of devotion. The world outside might have its long nights of unbroken rest, but inside the cloister, drowsiness itself was sacred. And so you might wonder, how did monks truly endure this rhythm? Did they find a strange peace in the broken hours of sleep, or did they simply stumble through exhaustion, clinging to prayer as a kind of anchor? And if sleep was this fragmented, what did it mean for their dreams, their health, their sense of time itself? The answers lie partly in the daily cycle yet to unfold. The long hours of labor, the rigid schedule of meals, the endless return to prayer. To understand how monks lived with so little rest, you must step further into the day, to see how their waking life absorbed and transformed their fatigue. The bell for lauds fades and daylight spills slowly into the cloister. The monks file out of the chapel, their chanting still echoing in the stone corridors. Their night has already been broken once by the midnight vigil, their second sleep cut short by the rising of the sun. Their bodies ache, eyes sting, and yet the day is only just beginning. In this world, fatigue is not a burden to be cured, but a quiet companion that follows them into every activity. After prayers, the monks gather for a light meal. Breakfast in the medieval monastery was never indulgent. In many orders it consisted of a piece of coarse bread, perhaps dipped in watered ale, or accompanied by a few dried figs. Some monasteries allowed cheese or porridge, but meat was almost universally forbidden. The diet was intentionally plain, designed to sustain the body without encouraging gluttony. Yet even in its simplicity, food served a purpose beyond nourishment. It provided structure, a punctuation mark in a day otherwise dominated by prayer and silence. The broken night of sleep meant the body longed for more, but the small meal was no cure. The monks often moved straight from the refectory to the fields, where manual labor awaited. Benedictine rules, which shaped much of Western monastic life, emphasized the balance of work and prayer, ora et labora, pray and work. By mid-morning, monks could be found bending over gardens, tending to orchards, or laboring in workshops where manuscripts were copied. The physical labor, though exhausting, may have helped them carry their fatigue. Moving the body, digging soil, or illuminating pages with steady hands kept drowsiness at bay, at least for a time. In many monasteries, silence was enforced, meaning the monks worked wordlessly alongside each other, without chatter to distract them. They moved in rhythm with the tasks at hand, their thoughts drifting perhaps towards scripture, perhaps toward the lingering heaviness of sleep. The quiet of the cloister was deceptive. Though outwardly peaceful, it hid the constant negotiation between bodily need and spiritual demand. It is worth considering how their broken sleep shaped their perception of time. Without clocks in the modern sense, the day was carved into hours by the ringing of bells. Monks did not think of time as a continuous flow, but as a sequence of sacred moments: prime, terce, sex, nun, vespers. Each prayer marked the passage of the day. Sleep, meals, and work were all fitted into these intervals. Fatigue may have blurred the edges between one hour and the next, but the bells never allowed the body to drift too far into forgetfulness. The rhythm was both oppressive and comforting. Some monasteries developed strategies to soften the burden. In warmer climates, a short nap was sometimes permitted after the midday meal, a concession that broke from the strict rigidity of the schedule, but acknowledged human frailty. Chroniclers occasionally note monks dozing during long services, their heads nodding in rhythm with the chants. While such slips might draw a stern look from an abbot, they were understood as inevitable. Even in a life dedicated to discipline, the body quietly claimed what it needed. The connection between sleep and spirituality remained constant. Fatigue was interpreted not as failure, but as sacrifice. To chant while weary, to pray while fighting drowsiness, was to offer more to God than prayer in full comfort. The tired monk was seen as closer to humility, stripped of worldly ease. In this sense, sleep deprivation itself became part of devotion, a small suffering that bound the body to the rhythm of the divine. But what of modern readers may wonder how monks managed long lives under such conditions. Records suggest mixed outcomes. Some monks, especially those who lived into old age, thrived within the system, their bodies accustomed to the broken rhythm. Others, however, suffered from chronic illness, exhaustion, or malnutrition. Monasteries sometimes became places of refuge for the weak, the sick, or the orphaned, and so the health of communities varied greatly. Still, the shared structure provided stability, and many monks lived longer than peasants outside the cloister, protected from famine and war. Dreams too played an important role in daily reflection. The brief bursts of sleep, punctuated by wakefulness, may have given rise to vivid dream states. Monks sometimes reported visions of angels, saints, or even demons, which were carefully recorded in monastery chronicles. The line between dream and spiritual vision blurred, and what modern science might explain as interrupted sleep cycles became for them glimpses into the supernatural. As the day lengthened, the fatigue of broken sleep became more pronounced. The voices chanting psalms grew hoarse, the hands illuminating manuscripts slowed, the steps in the cloister garden dragged, and yet the bell always rang, calling them back into motion. The discipline of the monastery was relentless, pulling the monk from drowsiness into prayer, from labor into silence, from silence back into prayer again. Now the most intriguing question lingers. What happened to the monks' perception of night itself? Did they see darkness as restful, or as a time of endless interruption? Did the midnight bell echoing across the stone halls feel like a holy summons or an unkind theft of sleep? To answer that, you must step deeper into the symbolic heart of monastic life. The idea that sleep itself was not the end of the day, but a rehearsal for death, and that waking in the middle of the night was a rehearsal for resurrection. As evening approached, the cycle began to fold in on itself again. Vespers filled the air with soft chanting, the low hum of voices carrying through the cloister gardens. The sun dipped behind the stone walls, shadows stretching long across the flagstones. For the monks, this was not just the close of a day, but the beginning of another turn in their ritual circle. The idea of sleep was never simply biological. To close one's eyes was to imitate death, a daily surrender of control. To wake again was to reenact resurrection, a quiet rehearsal for eternity. When the midnight bell pulled them from their beds, it was more than a demand for prayer. It was a reminder that the soul must always be prepared, ready to rise when summoned. This belief gave their broken nights a kind of meaning that softened the hardship. While we might pity their fatigue, they understood it differently. Each hour of interrupted rest was a small offering, a sacrifice of comfort in exchange for closeness to the divine. In the silence of their dormitories, with rough wool blankets pulled tight against the cold, they drifted into half-sleep, knowing that slumber itself was a kind of prayer. And yet, there was also something profoundly human in the way they adapted. The second sleep, those few hours between midnight and dawn, was not only tolerated, but in many places quietly cherished. Chroniclers note monks who used that time for reflection, for whispered conversations, or for solitary meditation in the garden. What modern science calls segmented sleep, they lived as a rhythm of the soul, a natural ebb and flow that turned the night into both burden and gift. Over the centuries, the monastic approach to sleep influenced wider society. Peasants, too, often followed a pattern of 2 sleeps, waking after midnight to tend fires, check animals, or share quiet moments with family. What began as sacred discipline within cloister walls slowly became a cultural norm, shaping how ordinary people imagined the rhythm of night. Only with the spread of artificial light in the early modern period did this pattern fade, replaced by the continuous 8-hour stretch we now consider normal. Looking back, the monks' relationship with sleep feels both alien and oddly familiar. Alien, because their lives were bound by bells, rules and rituals that few today could endure. Familiar, because in our own restless nights, those moments when we wake in the dark and cannot return to sleep, we glimpse the echo of their world. Perhaps we are closer to them than we think. So the question lingers: when a monk closed his eyes in a cold stone cell, listening for the midnight bell, did he dream of heaven or simply of rest? Imagine walking through the narrow lanes of ancient Rome, not toward the grand marble temples or the colonnades we usually imagine, but toward the smoke-filled corners where ordinary people lived their lives. The city was vast, noisy, and perpetually hungry. For the millions who crowded into its insulae, the tall apartment blocks where most Romans lived, cooking at home was nearly impossible. Fires were too dangerous, kitchens were rare, and so much of daily eating happened outside in the streets. This gave rise to a world of smells, sounds, and flavors that we can barely reconstruct today. Forget the feasts of emperors with stuffed dormice and peacock tongues. What most Romans knew was something humbler: hot bread pulled from clay ovens, bowls of lentils steaming with herbs, fried fish drizzled with a sour-sweet sauce, and chickpea patties that sizzled on iron griddles. At nearly every corner stood a thermopolium, something between a tavern and a takeaway stall. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of these counters in Pompeii, their marble tops still carved with deep jars that once held food. Standing there, you might have bought a cup of spiced wine, ladled warm from a bronze pot, or a portion of stew with beans and pork. For a few coins, the street fed you better than your own cramped apartment ever could. But it wasn't just food. Street eating was a kind of theatre, the baker shouting his prices, the hiss of oil as fish hit the pan, children darting between stools, their fingers sticky with honey cakes, donkeys clattering past, hauling amphorae of wine, the smells mingled: garlic, vinegar, smoke, and the sweetness of figs drying in the sun. Some dishes have survived in fragmentary recipes, thanks to writers like Apicius, whose cookbook recorded Roman tastes. A simple fried dough drizzled with honey might resemble something like our donuts. A porridge of spelt and cheese was a kind of comfort food for the poor. Even the sauces, strange to us now, were beloved. The famous garum, a fermented fish sauce, was splashed onto nearly everything, from meats to fruit. For a Roman, a meal without garum would be like bread without salt. Yet what made this world distinctive was not only the recipes but the way food connected people. Soldiers on leave, slaves with a few coins, merchants tired from bargaining, all gathered at the same counters. Eating in public was not shameful, it was ordinary. The hum of the city was sustained by these shared meals, bowls clutched in hand, eaten quickly before work resumed. To think of it is to realize how different their relationship to food was. For us, dining can be private, even solitary. For them it was communal, exposed, woven into the very streets. To eat was to join the rhythm of Rome itself, and still so many details remain lost. What did those honey cakes actually taste like when Roman bees fed on different flowers than ours? How pungent was garum, after months under the sun, when a baker pulled hot loaves from the oven and the steam drifted down the alley? How far could the smell carry, and how many stomachs rumbled in answer? We can only guess. The counters of Pompeii are silent now, the pots empty, the recipes scattered, yet the ghost of those meals lingers, if only we pause to imagine. So the question remains: if you stood in a Roman street, coins in your hand, and a dozen smells competing for your attention, what would you choose first? The city pulses with life. From the alleys of Subura to the bustling Forum, the smells of Roman street food thread through the air like invisible ribbons. You might pass a stall where a vendor stirs a thick porridge of farro with a wooden ladle, its steam rising into the morning sun. Or perhaps the sizzle of chickpea fritters on a bronze pan catches your attention, each piece crisping until golden, seasoned with cumin or coriander. These flavors were simple, yet to the people of Rome they were comfort, sustenance, and pleasure all at once. Ingredients tell a story of connection far beyond the city walls. The spelt, wheat and barley grown on estates along the Tiber provided the bulk of bread and porridge. Chickpeas and lentils came from North Africa or Spain, transported across Mediterranean trade routes by ship or car. Olive oil poured from amphorae made in Hispania Baetica, while honey dripped from hives tended on the hills of Apulia. Even the infamous garum, pungent fish sauce, might have traveled hundreds of miles, cured in ceramic jars along the coasts of Lusitania or Baetica, before reaching the Roman counters. Every bite connected you not just to Rome but to the wider world. Preparation was a spectacle in itself. Vendors worked quickly, hands moving with rhythm and precision. The chickpeas, soaked overnight, were mashed, mixed with flour, herbs, and sometimes bits of cheese, then formed into small patties and fried in olive oil. Bread was baked in clay ovens, its crust crackling as it cooled. Fish and small cuts of meat were seasoned liberally, often with herbs like dill, coriander, or rue. Even a modest meal demanded knowledge and skill. Too little oil, too much salt, and the entire batch could fail. Eating in these streets was communal, immersive, and sensory. The crowd pressed close, elbows brushing, voices mingling in a low hum punctuated by shouts and laughter. Children darted about, snatching crumbs or smaller portions of fried dough. Donkeys and carts clattered along cobblestones, mingling with the smells of vinegar, smoke, and roasting food. You ate with your hands or sometimes a simple wooden spoon, feeling both the texture of the food and the rhythm of the city around you. And yet, much of this world is lost to history. Archaeologists have found counters, jars, and fragments of utensils, but the precise flavors, the proportions, the recipes themselves, they are mostly gone. The texts that survive, like Apicius's cookbook, give hints, but they are often written for the wealthy, not the common street eater. We can reconstruct, but we cannot fully taste what Romans tasted in the lanes and alleys of their teeming metropolis. The seasonality of ingredients also shaped daily choices. Fish might appear fresh in one week, replaced by salted varieties the next. Chickpeas and lentils varied in texture depending on the harvest. Vendors adapted constantly, improvising with whatever was at hand. In this way, street food was both stable, following a recognizable menu of bread, legumes and fish, and fluid, changing with the tides of trade, the harvests and the whims of the city. And while street food nourished the body, it also reflected social reality. It was affordable, quick and practical, catering to workers, soldiers, slaves, and freedmen who could not afford the luxuries of banquets. Yet even the simple dishes carried cultural meaning. Garum, for example, was ubiquitous, not only because it enhanced taste, but because it was a mark of Roman identity. To eat without it was to feel disconnected, to taste the difference between the city's heart and the edges of its empire. The labor behind the scenes was just as vital as the food itself. Bakers worked through the night to ensure fresh bread. Fishmongers salted, dried and fried catches before dawn. Vendors polished pots, arranged amphorae, and called their wares with practiced cry. It was a rhythm of preparation, sales and consumption, all attuned to the city's pulse. To witness it is to glimpse an ecosystem of food, commerce and human endurance, thriving in the shadows of Rome's grandeur. And yet, as you imagine reaching for a warm loaf or dipping fried chickpeas into honey, a question lingers. If the city could vanish overnight, as it did in parts with fire or invasion, how many recipes disappeared with it? How many flavors that once defined daily life are now lost forever, leaving only faint echoes in text, pottery and imagination? The vendors' calls, the sizzling oil, the fragrant steam, they are suspended in history, half remembered, inviting you to taste what cannot be fully tasted. Night falls over Rome, and the streets grow quiet. The smoke and scents of the day linger faintly, drifting into the alleys as if reluctant to leave. The thermopolia stand empty now, the clay jars cold and silent, yet the memory of their bustling activity hangs in the air. You can almost hear the faint sizzle of chickpeas, the soft crackle of bread pulled from ovens, the low murmur of conversations between strangers sharing a quick meal on a stone bench. The story of Roman street food is more than just recipes. It is a glimpse into the everyday lives of ordinary people, the pulse of a city that history often forgets in favor of emperors and conquests. These meals sustained laborers, soldiers, and freedmen. They brought strangers together, weaving social bonds in the rhythm of sharing bread and porridge, fried fish and honey cakes. Every bite was part of the unseen architecture of urban life, holding the city together one meal at a time. And yet, so much of it is gone. Fires, floods, invasions and the relentless passage of time erased countless recipes and traditions. We reconstruct from fragments, pottery jars, burnt bread in ovens, occasional writings in cookbook. We can imagine the flavors, the textures, the smells, but they remain elusive, tantalizingly out of reach. The dishes that once flavored daily life have become ghosts, remembered in imagination more than in reality. This loss reminds us that history is not only about monuments or battles. Sometimes the most intimate and telling traces lie in what people ate, how they prepared it, and how it connected them to their city, their neighbors, and their world. A loaf of bread, a steaming porridge, or a handful of fried chickpeas could tell us more about Rome than a marble column ever could. These ordinary meals, humble and ephemeral, were monuments of a different kind, living, communal, fleeting, yet essential. Perhaps that is why imagining the thermopolia, the cooks and the hungry crowd feels almost like stepping into a dream. We can see the jars, smell the spices, feel the crowd pressing close, and yet we can never truly participate. We are visitors in a past reconstructed from fragments, tasting only with our imagination what the people of Rome experienced daily. And so, when you close your eyes and picture yourself in those streets, coins in hand, hot bread in the other, the sizzle of chickpeas nearby, it is not just a memory you are conjuring, it is a bridge across millennia. The recipes are lost, but their essence survives in the rhythm of daily life, in the human need for nourishment, warmth, and connection. The city sleeps now, its streets emptied of vendors and customers alike, and yet for a brief moment in imagination, you can still taste what Rome once tasted. The question lingers quietly: if all physical traces of daily life can vanish, what else might we be missing in history? The small, fleeting, invisible details that made everyday life rich, human, and unforgettable. Imagine standing on the edge of the Sahara, where golden sands stretch endlessly into the horizon, and the sun burns with a quiet intensity. In the distance, the mud-brick towers of Timbuktu rise like a mirage, their narrow windows and wooden beams holding secrets of centuries. This city, now famous for its name alone, was once a bustling hub of trade, scholarship and ideas. It was a place where books were as valuable as gold, and knowledge traveled across deserts in caravans heavier than any spice or ivory. Timbuktu's libraries were not marble palaces or Andan halls lined with scrolls in neat rows. They were often modest mud-brick structures, sometimes attached to mosques, sometimes hidden behind courtyards, guarded by families who had kept manuscripts for generations. The city's scholars collected texts on everything imaginable: astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, poetry, and theology. Many were written in Arabic, but some also preserved works in local languages, creating a unique repository of African intellectual history. Picture a cycle walking through narrow alleyways, scroll in hand, passing by merchants unloading salt, gold, and cloth from camel caravans. The streets smelled of spices and sweat, of sun-baked earth and distant rivers. In one corner, children played while copying letters from a worn page, their small hands tracing words that had survived centuries. In another, a teacher bent over a parchment, explaining the movements of the stars to a student who squinted in the harsh light. Knowledge in Timbuktu was alive, tactile, and deeply interwoven with daily life. These libraries were fragile but persistent. Each manuscript was painstakingly crafted on parchment or paper, inked with natural pigments that could fade with time, and bound by leather or cloth. Families guarded them fiercely, understanding that a single stolen book could erase years of scholarship. The manuscripts were not for show, they were living tools for teaching, learning, and governance. They traveled with scholars to neighboring cities, carried by merchants across the Sahara, sometimes hidden beneath sacks of millet or camel hides to protect them from sandstorms and thieves. Trade routes brought more than goods. They brought ideas. Timbuktu sat at the crossroads of West African commerce, connecting the gold fields of Mali to the salt mines of Tagaza, the forests of Guinea, and even distant regions beyond the Sahara. As merchants and scholars moved, they exchanged texts and commentaries, weaving a network of knowledge across deserts and rivers. A text on medicine might arrive from Morocco, a book of poetry from Cairo, or a treatise on mathematics from Andalusia. Each manuscript was a bridge, linking the city to a world far beyond its sun-baked walls. And yet these treasures were not widely recognized outside Africa for centuries. For much of history, European explorers and chroniclers overlooked Timbuktu, often dismissing it as a distant, mythical city of sand and gold. The reality, of course, was far richer. A vibrant intellectual life, a tradition of preservation, and a commitment to learning that rivaled any European library of the same period. Even today, the manuscripts that survive are a testament to human resilience. Despite invasions, colonial neglect, and the ravages of time, thousands of texts remain tucked away in private collections or small libraries. They whisper of a civilization that understood that knowledge was as precious as any treasure, and that safeguarding it was an act of both devotion and survival. But questions linger. How many manuscripts have been lost forever to fire, flood, or theft? How many ideas and discoveries vanished because they were never copied or translated? And what wisdom might we still recover if every hidden page could be read again? The sun dips lower over the city, and shadows stretch across the mud wall. The libraries sit quietly, waiting for readers to return, their secrets intact yet fragile, ready to tell the story of a city that was once the heartbeat of African learning. Inside the cool, dim interior of a Timbuktu library, time seems to slow. Scholars move quietly, barefoot or in simple sandals, careful not to disturb the fragile manuscripts piled in clay alcoves or woven baskets. The air is dry and warm, a necessity to preserve the delicate page. Each day a scholar's work begins with inspecting these texts, dusting the edges, checking for signs of decay and sometimes re-inking faded letters to ensure the words endure. This labor is meticulous, slow and repetitive, yet it is performed with reverence, as if each stroke of the pen is a prayer. Daily routines of scholars were structured and purposeful. Mornings were often devoted to copying texts, a painstaking process that could take hours or days. Ink was made from soot, gum and natural dyes, while the quills were carefully trimmed to allow for precise lettering. Any mistake could ruin a page, so concentration was paramount. In addition to copying, scholars spent time reading, debating and teaching. Students gathered on mats in quiet courtyards, listening attentively to their teacher explain the finer points of Islamic law, astronomy or medicine. Knowledge was transmitted orally and visually, with each manuscript serving as both guide and inspiration. Preservation was a constant concern. The manuscripts were vulnerable to humidity, insects and accidental damage. Many families developed ingenious methods to protect them, storing texts in cedar chests, wrapping pages in cloth, or keeping manuscripts away from sunlight and dust. Some libraries had entire rooms devoted solely to storage, raised on wooden platforms to avoid the encroaching damp of the earthen floor. The care lavished on each manuscript was immense. To own and protect one was a matter of pride, duty and spiritual significance. The content of these manuscripts was extraordinary. Beyond theology and law, scholars recorded histories of empires, genealogies of local rulers, treatises on medicine and herbs, and even astronomical observations that rivaled European knowledge of the same era. One text might describe the circulation of blood through the body, using meticulous observation and herbal remedies for treatment. Another could preserve poetic traditions, songs or proverbs, capturing the social and cultural fabric of West Africa. Each page was a window into a world often invisible to the wider historical record, a silent chronicle of intellect, creativity, and practical knowledge. Trade and travel enriched the collection further. Caravans from North Africa and the Middle East brought texts that introduced new ideas, mathematics from Morocco, philosophical commentaries from Cairo, and even maps detailing faraway lands. Scholars carefully studied, translated and sometimes adapted this information, blending it with local knowledge to create works uniquely Timbuktu's own. The city became a hub of cross-cultural intellectual exchange, a place where the desert's isolation paradoxically facilitated a rich network of learning. And yet, the fragility of this knowledge always loomed. Wars, political upheaval and the vagaries of climate threatened the survival of the libraries. Families who had protected manuscripts for generations lived with the constant awareness that centuries of accumulated wisdom could vanish overnight. To handle a manuscript was to touch not just paper but history itself, a reminder that knowledge, once lost, is almost impossible to recover fully. As the day waned, the scholars paused, observing the golden light filtering through wooden shutters. Students whispered as they gathered their scrolls, preparing to return home with their copies for evening study. Outside, the desert wind stirred the sands, carrying with it the distant echo of camel caravans, the hum of markets, and the faint smell of smoke from clay ovens. Life continued around the libraries, yet inside the manuscripts remained still, waiting patiently for the next hands, the next eyes to keep their knowledge alive. And so, one question lingers. If these manuscripts represent centuries of observation, debate and ingenuity, how much of humanity's accumulated wisdom has already slipped through time, lost to fire, neglect or simple decay? How many voices, ideas and discoveries will remain forever unheard? The libraries wait quietly, their silence heavy with the weight of untold stories, inviting us to wonder not just what they held, but what we might still recover if we looked carefully enough. Night settles over Timbuktu, and the mud brick city takes on a hushed, golden glow under the desert moon. Inside the libraries, the manuscripts remain still, their pages faintly yellowed, their ink slightly faded, yet filled with centuries of human thought. Each scroll is a vessel, carrying ideas, discoveries and stories across time, bridging generations that might otherwise have vanished into silence. The legacy of these libraries is profound. Timbuktu was not merely a city of trade or a remote outpost. It was a hub of learning, a center where human curiosity and intellectual rigor thrived in a place that outsiders often dismissed as barren. Knowledge was not hoarded in secret or limited to the elite. It was preserved, shared, and built upon, often within families who considered stewardship of manuscripts both a sacred duty and a practical necessity. Yet, despite this care, so much has been lost. Wars, colonial incursions, theft, and the slow erosion of time have erased countless texts. The manuscripts that survive today are only fragments of a once vast collection, offering glimpses into an intellectual world that was both sophisticated and deeply connected to daily life. Every surviving page is a miracle, a quiet testimony to human perseverance and the relentless desire to record, to teach, and to remember. Modern scholars and librarians have worked tirelessly to preserve what remains. Digitization projects, careful restorations, and collaborations with local communities aim to protect these treasures from further decay. But the exercise is not only about preservation, it is also about rediscovery. Each manuscript can challenge assumptions about African history, science, and culture, revealing a depth and complexity often overlooked in global narratives. In the careful study of these texts, we can hear voices long silent, see ideas long forgotten, and reconnect with a past that remains astonishingly vibrant. Reflecting on this, one cannot help but think about the fragility of knowledge everywhere. If centuries of care could be so nearly erased, what will future generations inherit from our own records, books, and digital archives? Timbuktu teaches a quiet lesson. Knowledge is precious, but it is also impermanent, dependent on human diligence, attention, and reverence. To touch a manuscript is to hold centuries of thought and to be reminded of how easily even the most enduring ideas can vanish if neglected. As the desert wind sweeps through the city carrying the faint echoes of merchants, scholars, and students long gone, you realize that these libraries are not merely repositories of texts. They are monuments to human curiosity, endurance, and imagination. They remind us that civilization is measured not just in stone and gold, but in the careful preservation of thought, in the patient recording of life, and in the quiet acts of stewardship that ensure memory survives. And so the question lingers in the silence of the night: if knowledge is so fragile, what will survive from our own time to tell future generations who we were, what we valued, and what we dreamed? The manuscripts rest quietly, as they have for centuries, inviting us to remember that even in a desert city at the edge of the known world, human thought can flourish, and that it is up to us to keep it alive. Imagine stepping into a London bedroom in the late. The gas lamps cast a soft flickering light across wallpaper patterned with floral designs, while a faint chill creeps through the uninsulated walls. Outside, carriages clatter along cobblestone streets, and the distant toll of Big Ben marks the hour. Inside, a gentleman, or perhaps a lady, lies awake, staring at the ceiling, restless, while the rest of the household sleeps. Sleep, it seems, is elusive, and in Victorian England the quest to achieve it was an art, a science, and sometimes a curiosity bordering on the absurd. Insomnia was not uncommon. The Industrial Revolution had introduced new rhythms, artificial lighting, and a host of distractions that interrupted natural sleep. Doctors and apothecaries offered a bewildering array of remedies, ranging from herbal teas to mechanical devices designed to rock sleepers into unconsciousness. Chamomile, valerian, and hops were brewed into nighttime potions, sometimes sweetened with sugar or honey, intended to calm the nerve. For the wealthier classes, more elaborate methods were employed: silk eye masks, feather-stuffed pillows, and even small vibrating beds meant to soothe the restless body. Yet some remedies seemed strange to modern eye. Cold baths, warm baths, and alternating temperatures were recommended, as were gentle head massages, or the placement of aromatic sachets filled with lavender and rosemary. One pamphlet from the era suggests the reading of monotonous texts, boring, uneventful stories as a means to lull the mind. The idea was simple: fill the imagination with mundane, predictable content until the brain, exhausted by lack of stimulation, finally surrendered to sleep. In certain cases, Victorian doctors prescribed opiates or chloral hydrate for extreme insomnia. These chemicals were taken with caution, yet they were widely used, revealing both the desperation of sleepless patients and the period's limited understanding of safe pharmacology. At the same time, many believed that insomnia itself was a moral failing, a sign of nerves untrained or a mind too indulgent in imagination. Remedies therefore were framed not only as treatments, but as corrective measures for behavior, decorum, and self-discipline. Daily routines also reflected the battle against sleeplessness. Evening walks in quiet streets, the regulation of meals, and even the timing of social visits were adjusted to encourage rest. Some households implemented strict lights-out hours, dimming lamps and closing shutters, while others relied on ambient sounds, the gentle ticking of a clock, the rustle of curtains in the evening breeze, or the distant sound of horses clopping along the streets. Every detail, from temperature to noise, mattered in the pursuit of restful slumber. Sleep diaries began to appear among the middle and upper classes, recording hours spent awake, times of tossing and turning, and perceived quality of sleep. These logs were analysed with surprising seriousness, sometimes informing both personal habits and medical advice. In a way, Victorian society treated sleep itself as a project, a measurable, improvable, and sometimes conquerable aspect of life. And yet, for all the prescriptions, tinctures, and contraptions, many still lay awake at night. The restless mind could not always be quieted, and the remedies, no matter how carefully selected, often people experimented constantly, mixing methods, consulting books, and seeking advice from friends and doctors alike. Each sleepless night became an exploration of human ingenuity, a quiet study in patience, frustration, and hope. So imagine yourself in one of these rooms, the lamps low, the cool night air brushing your face. You reach for a cup of chamomile tea, or perhaps a small silk sachet, and try to empty your mind of concerns. Yet sleep resists. How far would you go to capture the elusive rest? And which of these remedies, some forgotten and some dangerously potent, truly offered solace, or merely a ritual to chase the night away? The questions linger as the hours pass, and in the dim glow of Victorian candlelight, you are left to wonder, what does it take to sleep when the world is not yet ready to let you? As the evening deepens in a Victorian home, the struggle with sleeplessness becomes both personal and communal. Families followed routines that were as much about social order as they were about rest. Children were sent early to bed, lulled by quiet stories read by lamplight or the soft hum of a nursery rhyme. Adults, meanwhile, moved through a choreography designed to coax the body toward fatigue. Evening teas brewed from herbs, warm baths to relax tense muscles, and low-lit parlours meant to signal the day's end. Every flicker of candlelight, every rustle of silk curtains was part of an unspoken plan to regulate the household's sleep. For the middle and upper classes, bedrooms were sanctuaries meticulously prepared for optimal rest. Feather-stuffed mattresses were layered with blankets, silk sheets smoothed to remove wrinkles, and pillows fluffed just so. Aromatic oils, lavender sachets or sprigs of rosemary were placed nearby, their subtle scents thought to calm the mind. Some households even employed small devices, mechanical rocking contraptions or gently vibrating cushions, to lull the sleeper into unconsciousness. These efforts were practical and ceremonial. They were both remedies and performances, signaling that sleep, like health, required attention, care, and proper etiquette. In households where insomnia was chronic, rituals could become elaborate. Evening walks along quiet, gaslit streets helped to regulate body temperature and distract the mind from worries. Gentle music might accompany bedtime, a lullaby not for children alone, but for adults in need of a mental cue for relaxation. Reading material was chosen carefully. Monotonous, uneventful passages were preferred, with plotless stories or dull essays guiding the imagination toward boredom, a surprisingly effective tool in an era without television or electronic distraction. Yet social expectations also influenced sleep. The restless mind of a Victorian was not merely an individual problem, it reflected on one's moral and emotional character. Being unable to sleep could be interpreted as a sign of nervous weakness, poor discipline, or overindulgence in imagination. Advice books of the era often combined medical guidance with moral instruction, suggesting that mental order, temperance, and spiritual focus were as important to sleep as any physical remedy. A calm, disciplined mind was considered as necessary to a good night's rest, as a warm bath or herbal infusion. Others suggested gentle stimulation, a faint lamp to read by, the ticking of a clock, or the distant murmur of conversation, thought to reassure the mind that it was not alone in the dark. Occasionally the line between care and danger blurred, as remedies included opiates or other chemical sedatives, which brought relief but carried long-term risks. Sleep, in this context, became a delicate negotiation between natural rhythms, social norms, and experimental medicine. Despite all these strategies, insomnia persisted for many. A restless night might lead to a dull day, a distracted mind, and renewed anxiety as the cycle repeated. Yet in this persistence lies a human resilience, the continual search for balance, comfort, and control over a biological necessity that stubbornly refused to conform to social expectation. In these rituals we see patience, ingenuity, and the quiet hope that tomorrow might bring the rest that tonight denied. And as you imagine yourself lying awake in a gaslit Victorian room, surrounded by feather pillows, herbal scents, and faint street noises, the question emerges: which remedies truly soothed the restless mind, and which were little more than ceremonial gestures, offering the illusion of rest? Could the human body ever fully surrender when the mind is trained to worry, imagine, and measure each ticking hour against the relentless march of time? The night stretches onward, quiet yet alive with possibility, and the search for sleep continues, an enduring, intimate ritual that connects us to the restless souls of the past. The gas lamps are dimmed, and London streets outside grow quiet, though the echoes of carriages and distant conversations linger faintly in the air. Inside, the bedrooms of Victorian homes hold their stories of wakefulness: feather-stuffed mattresses, herbal infusions, silk pillows, and mechanical contraptions, all silent now, waiting for the next restless sleeper. Sleep, so often elusive, was never merely a personal experience. It was a social performance, a reflection of health, discipline, and the anxieties of a rapidly changing world. Victorian insomnia cures reveal a society deeply attentive to routine, ritual, and subtlety. The interplay between science and superstition, medical advice and moral instruction, created a tapestry of strategies designed to calm the mind and body. Tea, baths, aromatic oils, and monotonous reading were combined with social expectations. To sleep well was to demonstrate virtue, temperance, and emotional control. In this delicate balance, sleep became more than biological necessity. It became a symbol of order, decorum, and self-mastery. Yet, for all their ingenuity, many remedies were temporary, imperfect, or even hazardous. Opiates and chemical sedatives offered relief, but carried risk. Elaborate rituals soothed the mind only as long as they were faithfully executed. And still, sleeplessness persisted for countless Victorians, reminding us that some aspects of human experience resist control, no matter how carefully structured the world around them may be. In reflection, these practices illuminate much about Victorian life. They reveal a society negotiating the demands of industrialization, artificial light, social pressures, and evolving ideas of health. They show us the lengths to which people went to preserve a sense of normalcy, comfort, and control amid the restless rhythms of modernity. Perhaps most importantly, they remind us that sleep, like many aspects of daily life, has always been intertwined with culture, expectation, and imagination. And so, as you picture yourself lying awake in a softly lit Victorian bedroom, waiting for slumber to arrive, the question lingers: how much of our modern struggle with sleeplessness echoes that of these past centuries? Do our own rituals, apps, and remedies reflect true understanding, or are they simply contemporary versions of chamomile tea, monotonous books, and feather pillows, attempts to persuade the mind that rest is possible? Sleep finally comes, or perhaps it does not, but the lessons of Victorian insomnia remain. They whisper to us across time, teaching patience, curiosity, and the enduring human quest to find calm in the dark. Imagine approaching the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco in the heart of what is now Mexico City. The sun glints off small canals, and a gentle mist rises from the lake, softening the edges of reed-lined banks. Here, in a labyrinth of waterways, the Aztecs cultivated one of the most ingenious agricultural systems the world has ever known: the chinampas, or floating gardens. These were not merely gardens. They were carefully engineered platforms of soil, reeds, and mud, floating atop the shallow lake, sustaining the empire's food supply with astonishing efficiency. Walking along a narrow canal, you might see a farmer balancing on a wooden raft, planting maize or beans with meticulous care. Water lilies sway in the current, and the distant call of birds echoes across the open water. Every chinampa is a miniature ecosystem, layered with mud dredged from the lake, woven reeds to prevent erosion, and compost to nourish the plants. These gardens were productive, often yielding several harvests a year, providing sustenance for hundreds, and forming the foundation of an empire that would one day astonish the Spanish invaders. The design of chinampas reflects both practicality and observation. Canals ensured irrigation, allowed fish and ducks to coexist with crops, and served as transport routes for goods. The soil, rich in organic matter, created fertile beds that required minimal external input. Farmers rotated crops, incorporated flowers to attract pollinators, and sometimes even used small fish to fertilize the plants naturally. The gardens were alive in a way that modern industrial farms rarely are. Every element was interconnected, every organism part of a careful balance. Life on the Chinampas was both routine and delicate. Farmers rose early to tend the crops, wading through shallow canals, checking the growth of maize, beans, and squash. They repaired embankments, replanted herbs, and ensured that the water levels remained steady. Children sometimes assisted, learning the art of agriculture from an early age, their hands muddy and small, yet precise. The work was exhausting, yet deeply fulfilling. Each garden was a testament to knowledge passed down over generations, a quiet victory of human ingenuity over waterlogged terrain. The social dimension of the Chinampas is equally remarkable. They were managed collectively in many cases, with families or small communities sharing responsibilities and harvests. Festivals and rituals marked planting and harvesting times, blending practical labor with spiritual observance. To work the Chinampas was to be attuned not only to the seasons and the crops, but also to the sacred rhythms of Aztec cosmology, where fertility, water, and earth were intertwined with human activity. Yet much of this world is almost invisible to us today. The vast network of canals and gardens that once sustained Tenochtitlan has largely been filled in, built over, or drained. We can reconstruct it from codices, early Spanish accounts, and archaeological evidence, but to walk through the gardens as an Aztec would, feeling the sun on your face, the mud beneath your feet, the hum of life around you, is an experience that exists primarily in imagination. And so, as you drift along the canal, balancing on a narrow raft, planting maize seedlings in rich, wet soil, a question arises: how did the Aztecs develop such intricate agricultural mastery in the midst of a lake? And what lessons from this delicate, interwoven system might still inform the way we cultivate food and coexist with nature today? The sun glints on the water one last time before it dips below the horizon, leaving the Chinampas in a quiet shimmer of shadow and reflection. The morning mist rises gently over the canals, and the work on the Chinampas begins in earnest. Farmers step carefully onto the narrow platforms, feeling the moist soil beneath their feet and listening to the gentle lapping of water against the edges. Each Chinampa is a microcosm of life, maize stalks reaching toward the sun, beans climbing up supporting reeds, squash sprawling along the mud beds, and small fish darting beneath the surface. Everything has its place, and every organism contributes to the balance of the garden. Maintenance of the Chinampas was constant. Farmers monitored water levels, adding mud and plant matter to reinforce the floating platforms when erosion threatened. The canals themselves required care, as blockages could lead to stagnant water, damaging both crops and fish. The integration of aquaculture was particularly ingenious. Fish not only provided food but also fertilized the crops naturally. Ducks and other birds added to this ecological web, consuming insects and aiding in seed dispersal. Every day was an exercise in observation, subtle adjustment, and patience. The social fabric of Chinampa agriculture was equally vital. Many gardens were managed collectively, with families sharing responsibilities, tools, and harvest. Knowledge was passed orally and practically. Children learned planting techniques by watching and imitating adults, while elders instructed on timing, soil preparation, and spiritual rituals that guided agricultural practice. Planting and harvesting were marked with ceremonies and offerings, reinforcing the connection between human labor and the cycles of nature. The work was not only sustenance but also a spiritual dialogue with the land and water. Crop management involved remarkable foresight. Farmers rotated plantings to maintain soil fertility and experimented with companion planting, placing certain crops together to enhance growth or deter pests. Seasonal changes dictated what was planted where, and even the position of the sun and prevailing winds were considered when arranging seedlings. Fertilizers, often organic matter dredged from the lake or decomposed plant material, nourished the soil, creating a system that could sustain multiple harvests per year with minimal external input. The gardens were extraordinarily productive, capable of feeding the dense populations of Tenochtitlan, which thrived atop islands in the lake. Trade and logistics were integral to the Chinampas' success. Crops grown on the floating gardens were transported via canoes to the central marketplaces of the city, where merchants and buyers bartered goods daily. The efficiency of the canals allowed for swift movement of fresh produce, reducing spoilage and ensuring a continuous food supply. This transportation network was seamlessly woven into the fabric of urban life, linking individual gardens to the needs of an entire empire. And yet, for all their brilliance, the Chinampas remained delicate systems. Changes in water levels, extreme weather or neglect could compromise productivity. Farmers had to remain vigilant, adapting constantly to environmental conditions and maintaining a keen understanding of ecological balance. Their success was a testament to observation, ingenuity, and a profound respect for the natural world, a harmony rarely matched in other civilizations of the era. As the day wanes and the sun casts long reflections across the canals, one cannot help but wonder, what secrets of sustainable agriculture have we forgotten, lost to centuries of industrialization and urban expansion? Could the wisdom of these floating gardens, perfected over generations, teach us lessons about food, water, and ecological resilience that remain relevant today? The Chinampas glow softly in the evening light, a delicate lattice of life, balance, and human ingenuity, awaiting the next day's labor and the next cycle of growth. The sun sets slowly over Lake Texcoco, casting a golden haze across the water, and the Chinampas fall into quiet shadow. For centuries these floating gardens nourished an empire, their rhythms shaping not only daily life, but also the very survival of Tenochtitlan. To understand their legacy is to glimpse how human ingenuity and the natural world once worked together in delicate harmony. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, they marveled at the abundance and intricacy of the Chinampa. Chroniclers described canals lined with produce-laden canoes, bustling markets filled with vegetables, flowers, and herbs, evidence of a city sustained by an agricultural system unlike any in Europe. Yet the conquest brought disruption. The destruction of Tenochtitlan, the draining of lakes, and the imposition of new systems of land use gradually eroded the networks of floating gardens. Over time, many canals were filled in, transformed into roads and urban spaces, until only fragments of the old system remained. Still, the Chinampas did not vanish entirely. In places like Xochimilco, remnants of the ancient gardens survive, maintained by local farmers who continue to cultivate vegetables and flowers in much the same way their ancestors once did. These surviving Chinampas serve as living echoes of a past world, fragile yet enduring, offering a glimpse into the resilience of traditional knowledge despite centuries of upheaval. What makes the story of the Chinampas so compelling is not only their history but also their relevance today. In an era of climate change, water scarcity, and industrialized farming, the principles of Chinampa agriculture, sustainability, ecological integration, and respect for natural cycles carry lessons we can no longer afford to overlook. Their design minimized waste, maximized productivity, and created thriving ecosystems where plants, animals, and humans coexisted in balance. They remind us that progress is not always about inventing the new. Sometimes it is about remembering the wisdom of the old. The Chinampas also challenge our perception of what is advanced. Too often, we imagine technology as machinery, factories, or towering structures. Yet the Aztecs, without steel or industrial engines, created a system of agriculture so efficient that it supported one of the largest cities in the pre-Columbian Americas. Their floating gardens were a technology of patience, observation, and harmony, qualities that modern life sometimes forgets. As night falls, the canals grow still, and the faint scent of wet earth lingers in the air. The reflection of stars dances on the water, much as it did centuries ago when Aztec farmers guided their rafts through the dark to check their crop. The Chinampas remain in memory, and in fragments of reality, whispering across time that survival and abundance are possible when humanity learns to work with the natural world, not against it. And so the question lingers as the last light fades. In a world searching for sustainable answers, could the wisdom of the Aztec floating gardens hold the key to a more balanced future? Picture yourself in a medieval town just after sunset. The streets, once alive with vendors and clattering carts, now fall into shadow. The only light comes from a few lanterns swaying in the wind, and behind shuttered windows the soft flickering glow of candles. In a world without electricity, the candle was not merely a convenience. It was survival, ritual, and sometimes even luxury. Most households depended on tallow candles made from rendered animal fat. Their light was dim, their odor faintly sour, and they dripped unevenly, but they were cheap enough to be within reach of ordinary folk. To light one was to acknowledge necessity. Meals eaten after sundown, tasks extended into the night, prayers whispered in the dark. The flame, small as it was, pushed back the overwhelming presence of night, transforming rooms from void into spaces of warmth and human presence. For the wealthier, beeswax candles offered a brighter, cleaner, and more fragrant alternative. Their golden glow filled churches and aristocratic halls with a sense of reverence and refinement. The expense was considerable. Beeswax had to be gathered in limited supply and carefully processed, but the result was a flame that burned longer and more steadily. To light such a candle was a sign of prestige, a statement that one's household could afford illumination beyond the bare minimum. Candles shaped daily rhythms in profound ways. In monasteries, the ringing of bells and the glow of candles intertwined, marking hours of prayer that stretched into midnight vigils. In castles, they accompanied feasts that lingered long past sunset, their smoke curling into the rafters while minstrels played. In cottages, a single tallow candle might be carefully rationed, used sparingly for essential tasks before being pinched out to save for the next evening. Time itself bent around the candle's flame. The length of a candle became a measure, a way to mark passing hours in a world without The act of lighting a candle carried meaning too. To strike flint, coax sparks and watch the wick catch fire was to transform night into day, despair into comfort. It was both mundane and sacred. Candles were offered in churches as prayers in physical form, one flame for each soul remembered, each hope extended toward heaven. They were carried in processions, guiding communities through darkened streets during holy festivals, the collective glow forming a river of light against the surrounding night. And yet candles were fragile companions. A draught could extinguish them, a spill could waste them, and each flame consumed resources that were not easily replaced. Their impermanence mirrored the fragility of medieval life itself, where each small comfort came at a cost, and each evening brought the same questions: would the flame last until morning? Would the household ration be enough to see them through the week? As you sit by the glow of a single candle in a medieval chamber, its light casting long shadows on rough wooden walls, you cannot help but wonder, how did such a small, flickering flame shape the way people thought about time, ritual, and even their own mortality in a world defined by darkness? The candle sputters softly, its wax dripping down in slow rivulets, and the night grows deeper around it. If you were to walk through a medieval marketplace, somewhere between the stalls of salted fish, bolts of cloth, and baskets of onions, you would often find a vendor selling candles. They were not glamorous items, yet they were indispensable. Candles were tools for survival, but they also carried with them subtle layers of meaning, economy, and belief. The tallow candle, made from rendered fat of sheep, cows, or pigs, was the candle of the poor. Its production was a messy and unpleasant task, the smell of boiling fat heavy in the air, clinging to the walls of the shanders' workshops. The result was a crude, uneven stick that smoked as it burned. For peasants, it was the difference between being able to read a prayer after sundown, or sitting silently in darkness. A single tallow candle might represent hours of labor, purchased with care and used sparingly, every drop of wax guarded against waste. Beeswax candles were another world entirely. They required not only access to bees but also the patience to refine wax into smooth, clean-burning tapers. This made them expensive, sometimes prohibitively so for common people. Churches, wealthy monasteries, and noble households became the main buyers. Their glowing golden light was tied to religious ritual. The purity of beeswax symbolized the Virgin Mary, while the flame itself was seen as a representation of Christ, the light of the world. When entire churches filled with beeswax tapers during feast days, the effect was overwhelming. For many who entered those sacred spaces, it was perhaps the brightest, most dazzling sight of their life. This distinction between tallow and beeswax candles created a quiet line of social division. To light a beeswax candle at home was not only a practical act, but also a declaration of wealth and status. To rely on tallow was to remain within the bounds of necessity. Even the smell separated classes. The faint, honeyed fragrance of beeswax versus the sour smoke of tallow. Economically, candles shaped towns in ways that might seem invisible to us now. The craft of the chandler, those who produced candles, became a recognized guild in many cities. Regulations controlled who could sell, what could be sold, and how quality was maintained. Candle production linked rural and urban economies. Farmers who raised livestock provided the fat, while beekeepers in the countryside supplied wax. These resources flowed into towns where chandlers transformed them into objects that, though humble, were vital. Candles even became a form of measuring time. Before the spread of mechanical clocks, some monasteries used candle clocks. A tall candle marked with lines. As the candle burned, Monks could track the passing of hours. This system was not precise by modern standards, but in a world where time was flexible, it was reliable enough. One candle could structure an evening's prayers, remind a monk when to rise, or guide travelers at night. But beyond economy and timekeeping, candles carried a weight of symbolism. In households, a single candle could represent domestic safety. In courts, clusters of candles reflected power and grandeur. In churches, they embodied prayers rising heavenward. Even their extinguishing carried meaning. To snuff out a candle before guests departed might be seen as bad luck, a sign that the flame of hospitality was ending abruptly. To keep one burning during illness was a gesture of protection, a small shield against the encroaching darkness of death. Every flicker, every shadow, every drip of wax held significance. The flame was not just light, it was life itself, fragile and short-lived. People projected their fears and hopes into it, reading omens into the way a wick burned, or the direction in which smoke curled. Superstitions grew around them. A candle suddenly sputtering could mean misfortune, while a steady flame during prayer suggested divine approval. And yet, for all this weight of meaning, the candle remained, at its core, a modest tool. It was lit, it burned, it vanished. Its simplicity belied the world it illuminated, the labor of those who made it, the rituals it framed, and the economies it sustained. As you imagine walking through a candlelit cathedral, the air thick with incense and glowing with hundreds of flame, one cannot help but wonder, was the awe inspired by the sacred space itself, or was it the collective force of those tiny flickering flames, each one carrying centuries of meaning? The candles burn on, their wax dripping steadily, their flames dancing in the draught of unseen doors. The night outside remains vast, but within these walls the glow feels eternal. The decline of the candle was not sudden, it was slow, like the dimming of a flame that lingers before going out. For centuries, candles had been the guardians of the night, standing between humanity and the vast darkness. But the invention of new lighting technologies gradually pushed them aside, reducing their practical role while preserving their symbolic one. Oil lamps began the transition in certain regions, providing longer and steadier light. Yet it was not until the arrival of gas lamps in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then electricity in the late 19th, that the candle truly lost its centrality. Imagine a medieval monk, carefully measuring time by candle drips, contrasted with a Victorian child watching the sudden brilliance of a gaslight flicker on in the street. The transformation was radical. By the time electric lighting spread, candles no longer carried the burden of necessity. Homes and cities could be illuminated at the flip of a switch. Candles became optional, a choice rather than survival. They slipped from the realm of the practical into the realm of the symbolic. Yet, curiously, candles never vanished. Instead, they clung to human culture with a surprising persistence. Churches, for example, did not discard them. Their golden glow remained essential to ritual, symbolizing devotion, prayer, and divine presence. Even as cathedrals installed electric lights, rows of votive candles continued to flicker in quiet chapels. The act of lighting a candle for someone, a small flame offered in hope or remembrance, remained unchanged. In households too, candles endured. They migrated from the workbench to the dinner table, from the peasant's corner to the parlor of the bourgeoisie. They were used to create mood rather than simply light. Romantic dinners, festive celebrations, or evenings of reflection often relied on their soft glow, even when far brighter options were available. The candle no longer illuminated necessity, it illuminated meaning. In some ways, candles even grew in significance, precisely because they were no longer common. To light one became an act of intention. Birthdays were celebrated, not with gas or electric bulbs, but with candles placed carefully on cake. Memorials to the dead were marked with candles arranged in silence. Entire festivals, such as Hanukkah or Diwali, continued to find their heart in the lighting of small flames, traditions that spanned back centuries. Modern psychology even offers an explanation for their enduring appeal. The steady flame, warm color, and subtle scent can induce a calming effect, lowering stress and creating a sense of intimacy. This is not far from what our medieval ancestors might have felt, gathering around a single tallow candle for company in the dark. It seems the human relationship to fire and light is older than any invention, rooted deep in memory and survival. And so, even in an age of LED bulbs and glowing screens, the candle holds its ground, not because it is useful, but because it is profoundly human. It connects us backward through centuries of history to the smoky kitchens of peasants, the glowing altars of cathedrals, the chanting of monks, the marketplaces of towns, and even further to the primal hearth fires of our distant ancestors. When you next see a candle flickering in a darkened room, remember that you are watching something ancient, a companion that once guided lives, measured hours, and carried prayers. Its flame is small, but in its persistence, it has outlasted empires, kings, and invention. And perhaps the real mystery is this: why do we, surrounded by brilliant light, still feel comfort in something so fragile and fleeting? Could it be that the candle's glow reminds us not only of the past, but also of our own impermanence, our own brief flicker in the long night of history? The wax drips, the wick shortens, the flame wavers, and still we watch. Imagine standing on a winding Andean mountain path, thin air filling your lungs, the jagged peaks rising around you like silent walls of stone. There is no wheel here, no horses galloping to carry letters, and yet, if the Sapa Inca, the emperor himself, needed a message delivered from the capital of Cusco to the distant edges of the empire, that message could travel astonishingly fast, faster in fact, than some messages in Europe at the same time. Through a system both brilliantly simple and mind-numbingly tedious, the Inca relay of runners. The Incas called them chasquias. These were young men trained to run, wait, and run again. They lived in small huts called tambos, scattered like beads along the empire's vast network of roads. A message would begin at one tambo, and as soon as the runner spotted his successor in the distance, he would shout, hand off the message, and collapse into rest, while the next man sprinted away. In this way, a message could travel up to 250 miles in a single day. But here is where the boredom creeps in, the part of history that rarely makes it into epic retellings. Imagine being a chasquias. Most of your day was spent waiting. You would rise before dawn, check the small hut for supplies, stretch perhaps, and then wait. Hours could pass with nothing. Then suddenly, a figure appeared down the road, running at full speed. Your heart would leap. Finally, you dashed forward, took the message, sometimes knotted cords known as quipus, sometimes spoken memorization, ran a short distance, then handed it off again, and then back to waiting. Hours of stillness broken by a few frantic bursts of movement. It was monotonous, yet utterly vital. The roads themselves were the empire's pride, paved in some stretches, cut into mountain sides in others, and stretching over 20,000 miles, they stitched together regions of desert, jungle, and highland. To the Inca, the roads were not just for travel, they were veins carrying lifeblood, keeping a far-flung empire connected. Without them, communication would collapse. But for the chasquias, who manned those lonely tambos, life meant endless days staring at the horizon, scanning for the next flicker of movement, waiting to perform their small part in a great machine. And it wasn't only messages they carried. Fresh fish from the Pacific could reach the emperor's table in Cusco while still edible. Thanks to these runners, rare goods, urgent orders, news of rebellions, all sped along this human relay. Yet the work was anonymous. No one remembered the names of the chasquias. They were as fleeting as the messages they carried, shadows moving across stone paths, soon forgotten. Still, imagine the discipline required. A chasquias could not afford to grow distracted or drowsy. To fail in his duty was to break the chain, to leave an imperial command stranded on the side of a mountain. So he watched and waited, and watched some more, until finally the chance came to sprint, legs burning, lungs aching in the thin air, and then, as quickly as it came, it was over. Back to waiting. This system, boring though it might seem in its repetition, was the hidden engine of an empire. Without it, provinces would drift, armies would move too late, and Cusco's power would fracture. The Inca did not need wheels when they had endurance and patience. They conquered not only with armies, but with men who ran, then rested, then ran again, endlessly. And yet one can't help but ask, what was it like to live your life as a link in a chain you would never see the end of? Did the chasquias ever imagine the weight of the messages they carried? Or did they simply see the horizon, the next runner, and the long stretch of stone underfoot? The genius of the Inca postal system was not only in the runners, but also in the way messages themselves were crafted. Most written empires, whether Egypt, Mesopotamia, or china depended on paper, clay, or papyrus. The Incas, however, had no written alphabet. Instead, they developed something stranger, quieter, and at first glance, utterly boring, chords of knotted string called quipi. A quipi was not much to look at, a main chord from which dangled dozens of thinner strings, each dyed in muted colors, brown, blue, red, yellow. Along these strands were knots, some tight, some loose, some bunched together, others spaced apart. To the untrained eye it resembled a child's toy or perhaps the remnants of a fishing net. But to a skilled quipu keeper, or quipu kamaok, it was a ledger, a record, a message. Most quipus recorded numbers, censuses, harvest counts, labor obligation. Through a positional knot system, they captured units, tens, hundreds, and beyond. Imagine running your fingers along a cord and feeling not ink, but carefully tied knots, each placement silently representing Some scholars argue that more than numbers were hidden within, that colors, positions, and knot styles encoded words, ideas, or even narratives. If true, then quipus were a woven language, a tactile script, that eludes easy translation even today. When a chaskia carried a quipu, he was not simply ferrying thread, he was bearing the lifeblood of the empire, data, messages, orders, all embedded in strands of string, and when he handed it to the next runner, that exchange was as crucial as passing a sealed letter in medieval Europe. The cords themselves were durable, light, and easily transportable, ideal for long journeys through mountains where parchment would rot, and ink would run. The roads too were marvels of engineering. In Europe, roads often crumbled after Rome's fall, but in the Andes, the Incas built pathways that endured centuries, paved with stone, bridged across gorges with woven rope, or cut directly into the sides of cliffs. They were as reliable as the Andes were unforgiving. Tambos, the relay huts, dotted these roads at intervals of a few miles. Each was stocked with food, blankets, and sometimes llamas for official use. In effect, the entire empire was a living network, an early communications grid woven across mountains, deserts, and jungle. The reliability of this system gave Cusco enormous power. Imagine a distant governor overseeing a rebellious province. His actions could be reported to the emperor within days, punishment dispatched swiftly. Armies could be mobilized in response to threats, long before an enemy expected retaliation. News of harvests or shortages allowed redistribution of resources. Even cultural exchanges, songs, oral traditions, rituals moved along these roads, carried in the memories of runners and administrators. Still, life for the Chasquis remained monotonous. Hours of watching mountain horizons, listening to wind whistle through stone valleys. Occasionally, a llama caravan passed, bells clinking dully, the smell of wool and dust in the air. At times, entire days might pass without a single urgent message, and then, without warning, one would appear, a runner gasping, a quipu in hand, urgency in his stride. The quiet hut, once again, transformed into the node of an empire's lifeline. It is tempting to imagine a Chasqui contemplating the cords he carried. Did he understand their meaning? Most likely not. Quipus were guarded knowledge, understood only by trained keepers. To the runner they were simply objects of duty, their meaning hidden in tangles of thread. And yet he may have felt their weight, not in pounds, but in consequence. These knots decided, tribute owed, labor demanded, punishments decreed. They were power disguised as string. Over time, as Spanish conquerors arrived, the Quipus baffled them. Accustomed to letters and ink, they dismissed the cords as primitive accounting tools. Many were destroyed, their secrets lost. Today, only a few hundred remain, tucked away in museums, silent but still unreadable in full. We know they counted, we suspect they told stories, but we cannot fully hear the voices they carried. And so the Inca postal system becomes even more haunting. Imagine messages speeding across the Andes at record pace, faster than medieval Europe's posts, yet written in a language we can no longer understand. Words tied into knots, carried by breathless runners, passed from hand to hand, from tambo to tambo, until they reached Cusco. Messages once urgent, once vital, now mute. The silence of these lost voices lingers like the stillness of a waiting Chasqui, and one cannot help but wonder, were those cords merely records of crops and taxes, or did they once hold stories, names, perhaps even poetry that will never again be untangled? The fall of the Inca Empire is often told in terms of battles, conquistadors and diseases carried across ocean. Yet behind these dramatic moments, the decline of the postal system tells its own quieter story. For when the roads grew silent and the runners stopped running, an empire once bound together unraveled thread by thread. At the height of its power, the postal network was the empire's nervous system. Messages pulsed across the Andes like signals across a body, ensuring swift coordination. But when Spanish invaders arrived in the 16th century, the runners faced confusion. Should they continue to carry messages for an emperor captured in his own palace? Should they obey foreign orders, or wait for guidance that never came? The quipus themselves baffled the newcomers. The Spaniards distrusted them, seeing only strange knots without meaning. Many were burned, either in fear that they contained heresy, or in disregard for their value. The trained quipu Kameko, keepers of the cords, were often silenced or repurposed into colonial administration. Without the custodians of this system, cords turned meaningless, and the runners' tasks diminished. The tambos, once alive with movement, grew empty. Some were converted into Spanish way stations. Others crumbled into ruins. Roads that had thrummed with footsteps now lay quiet, their stones warmed only by sun and wind. The chain of communication, once so finely tuned, broke apart. Messages no longer sped across mountains. Provinces no longer felt Cusco's command as sharply as before. The empire's unity, so dependent on these networks, faded into fragments. For the Chasquis themselves, the decline must have been disorienting. To live for duty, to run and wait, and run again, and then suddenly to find that duty erased what did they do. Some likely adapted, guiding Spaniards, carrying supplies, or vanishing back into villages. Others may have tried to preserve their work, running messages between communities even as the empire collapsed. But their names are lost, their lives only faintly remembered through the echo of roads they once filled with breath and sweat. And yet, though the runners disappeared, their legacy survived in the stones under. The roads of the Incas proved so durable that centuries later they are still walked. Hikers tread them now as tourists. Farmers still use them to link villages. The ghost of the postal system lingers in the very landscape of the Andes. Even when the empire fell silent, the paths remembered. Perhaps the strangest thought of all is this: a system so vital, so ingenious, could vanish almost overnight, leaving behind little more than ruins and riddles. We can imagine the last Chasqui standing in his tambo, scanning the horizon as always, waiting for a runner who never came. His ears filled with silence, his duty dissolved by conquest, a link broken, a message undelivered. And as we look back now, centuries later, we are left with questions as tangled as the knots of a quipu. What secrets lay in those cords destroyed by fire? What names, what stories, what forgotten decisions sped across mountains on tired legs? And how much of an empire's strength depends not on kings and armies, but on the unseen runners who carried the weight of communication, day after day, until history left them behind. The flame of the Inca runners has long gone out, but in every story told of them, in every footstep on an old Andean road, a faint echo of their breathless relay endures. And that brings us to the end of tonight's final story. From perfume cones in Egypt, to flickering medieval candles, and now to the tireless runners of the Inca roads. Each tale is a small window into lives both ordinary and extraordinary. But I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? What time is it for you right now as you drift off to sleep? And of all these stories so far, which one has lingered with you the most? Your answers are always fascinating, because even though we're separated by miles and centuries, for a little while we're all gathered here together in the glow of history's quieter corner. So dim the lights, let your thoughts wander, and if you've enjoyed this journey with me, remember you can always join again for more nights of boring, dreamy history. Good night, my fellow time traveler.